Okay, so in today's class, we're going to talk a little bit about chemical reactions. So, just like I always do, I am going to share some of the concepts or the most important concepts of the section. And hopefully, this video will help you guys in terms of reviewing for the class. So, let me get started here and let me start sharing my whiteboard. And that way we can get rolling with today's lesson. So, what we're going to be discussing today, ladies and gentlemen, is chemical reactions. And chemical reactions are an extremely important part of biology. And all organisms undergo reactions. And if we talk about chemistry, matter in general undergoes reactions. So, let's get started. Yes? Um, Again, I'm in the topic that says main idea. And the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to define what a chemical reaction is. And we define a chemical reaction as a change in substances into different substances by breaking and forming chemical bonds. So basically, what a chemical reaction, and let me see if I can type it in here. A chemical reaction is, our changes can be defined as changes in substances, can be defined as changes in substances into different substances. Different substances by breaking and forming chemical bonds. Now, something that you need to understand about chemical reactions is that basically a chemical reaction is the breaking of something and the formation of something new. So it's like oxygen and hydrogen combine to make water. Oxygen is a gas in its natural state, just like hydrogen, but when they combine, they form water, which is an entirely different substance. So in a chemical reaction, you're definitely going to have something different. And we're actually going to talk right now a little bit about reactants and products. So today's lesson is not necessarily going to be a very long one. Um, I'm actually on in your book on section 2.4, specifically in the paragraph that says main idea. And the paragraph starts by saying reactants, products, and bond energy. It says your cells need the oxygen molecules that you breathe in oxygen. Um, it says your cells, I'm sorry, need the oxygen molecules that you breathe in. Oxygen plays a part in a series of chemical reactions that provides usable energy for your cells. These reactions, which are described in detail in chapter Cells and Energy, break down the simple sugar glucose C6H12O6. It says the processes uses oxygen and glucose and results in carbon dioxide and water and usable energy. It says oxygen and glucose are the reactants. And let's talk about reactants. Okay, so in order for us to, or for me to define this, let's talk about um, let's actually look at the reaction. So reactants and products. Now, in order for me to understand, we're going to talk about a very important chemical reaction that occurs in the body, which is basically the breaking down of sugar and the forming of carbon dioxide and water. So, in a chemical reaction, and we're going to see this a little bit later on in detail, we have 6 molecules of oxygen and we have sugar, and the chemical formula for sugar is C. Remember that sugar is a carbon-based molecule. 6 C6H12. So that means it has 6 carbon molecules, 12 hydrogen molecules. Okay, H12. and O6 as well. And basically, you have 6 oxygen molecules, 1 sugar molecule, and that sugar molecule is going to turn. And in chemistry, when we talk about chemical reactions, this little arrow just means in what direction the reaction is going. In this case, it's going from left to right. And we're going to end up with 6 carbon dioxide molecules. So 6 carbon dioxide molecules, CO2. And we're going to have 6 carbon dioxide molecules and 6 water molecules. 6 carbon dioxide molecules and 6 oxygen molecules, or water molecules, excuse me, 6 water molecules. Now, let's look at this chemical reaction and then first see if it has all the characteristics of the definition that I gave before of a chemical reaction that I defined right above this. Give me 1 second, ladies and gentlemen. We're learning all how to use this little pencil thingy. Okay, so a chemical reaction can be defined as the changes in substances into different substances by breaking and forming chemical bonds. So these are the substances that I have at the beginning of the reaction: 6 oxygen molecules and 1 sugar molecule. And then I end up with 6 carbon dioxide molecules. This is a 2. It doesn't look like it, but that's a 2. And 6 water molecules. So do I start with a substance and end with a different one? Yes. Are new bonds broken and formed? Well, yes, because here I have 6 molecules of oxygen bonded together, and then I end up with 6 carbon dioxide. So definitely bonds are broken here, and they're also broken here in sugar, and new ones are formed because I have 6 carbon dioxide molecules and 6 water molecules. So again, these that complies into what it defines as a chemical reaction. Now let's talk about reactants and products. Okay, it says the reactants are the substances changed during a chemical reaction. So the substances changed in this case are the oxygen and the glucose. So these are my reactants. Okay, reactants. And you know what? I think I'm just going to type it. It's easier if I type it. So right here, these are my reactants. Let me erase this. Let me erase it and let me just write it. So right here, these are my reactants. And here are my products. Reactants is what's changed in the chemical reaction, and of course, the oxygen and the carbon dioxide are changed. And what I have at the end of the reaction, which in this case is carbon dioxide and water, are my products. So let's define real quick what reactants and products are. So let me do this real quick. Reactants and products. Okay, so what I'm going to do is define reactants. And it says reactants are the substances changed during a chemical reaction. Are the substances changed during a chemical reaction. And the products, which are in this case are right here, products are the substances made by chemical reaction. Are the substances made by chemical reaction. Okay, so these are reactants and these are our products. Reactants are the substances changed during a chemical reaction, in this case carbon dioxide, sugar and oxygen. And the products are the substances made by chemical reaction, which in this case are 6 carbon dioxide molecules and 6 water molecules. All right. So we have our chemical reaction, we have our reactants, and we have our products. Now, reading from your book, it says chemical equations are used to show what happens during a reaction. The overall equation for the process that changes oxygen and glucose into carbon dioxide and water is so this right here, and let me use a different color to illustrate it. This right here is a chemical equation. Okay, so this is a chemical equation right here. Let me use a different color. This is a chemical equation. So this that you see, kind of boxed in red, is what we call a chemical reaction, and equation, excuse me. And a chemical equation basically just illustrates what happened. It illustrates what reactants I have at the beginning, in what direction the reaction goes, and what products I have at the end. So this chemical equation is explaining the process in which oxygen and sugar are broken down into water and carbon dioxide. So moving on, it says the reactants are on the left, which are right here, and right here are the reactants along with the definition, and are on the left side of the equation, and the products are on the right side of the equation. The arrow shows the direction of the reaction. Okay, so just again, the arrow just shows the direction. What the arrow is indicating is that oxygen and sugar are going to be turned into carbon dioxide and water. It says this process, which is called cellular respiration, makes the carbon dioxide and water vapor that you breathe. So basically, and we're gonna talk about cellular respiration soon, but basically this is what makes this process is the process that makes the water vapor and the oxygen that you breathe. And I'm actually going to write that down here. This is actually cellular respiration. So cellular respiration right here. And again, this is a very, 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 very brief explanation. It says cellular respiration makes the carbon dioxide and water. Respiration makes the carbon dioxide and water makes the carbon dioxide and water vapor that you breathe out. Okay, so the carbon dioxide and the water vapor that we breathe out in cellular respiration. Okay. Um, it says, but for carbon dioxide and water to be made, bonds must be broken in reactants and bond must be formed in the products. It says what causes bonds in oxygen and glucose molecules to break, and what happens when new bonds form in carbon dioxide. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to talk about energy. And what energy does is it allows certain reactions to occur. Okay. So, again, cellular respiration breaks down oxygen and sugar into carbon dioxide and water, which is the carbon dioxide and the water vapor that we breathe. Um, but the question is, what causes this? What happens? Well, chemical reactions need energy, and that's what we're going to talk about now. Now, energy in the physical world is mainly seen in the form of heat. So, in some way, shape, or form, there is heat present or energy present. Not just necessarily heat, although heat is the way you mainly see it, but it doesn't necessarily have to be heat. Okay, and we're going to talk about energy. And it says energy is added to break bonds in molecules. So we have to understand that if we have that reaction that we saw a minute ago, let me see if I can undo it. So yeah, so if we have this reaction, and actually, you know what? Let me just do this. So In this reaction, in order for this, the oxygen and the sugar, to turn into carbon dioxide and water, energy needs to be added. So, why does energy need to be added? Well, because the energy is going to cause the breaking of certain bonds and it's going to cause the forming of new bonds. So, let's actually talk about that real quick. It says energy is added to break bonds in molecules. Okay, energy is added to break bonds in molecules. Energy is added to break bonds in molecules. Okay. Um, in this case, it's added to break down molecules of oxygen and glucose. But let's talk a little bit about bond energy. So energy, I know that energy is added to break down this and form this. Now let's define bond energy for a minute. Bond energy is the amount of energy that will break a bond between two atoms. Is the amount of energy that will break bonds between two atoms. So here, what energy do I, or how much bond energy would be the amount of energy that I apply in order to break the bonds that are in oxygen and to break the bonds that are in sugar or glucose. Okay. And your book goes on to say that bonds between different types of atoms have different bond energies. So that means that if I have a covalent bond, or if I have a hydrogen bond, or any other type of bond, that type of bond that I have is going to depend on the amount of energy that I use. Okay. Um, a certain amount of energy is needed to break bonds into oxygen and is needed, excuse me, to break bonds in an oxygen molecules. A different amount of energy is needed to break bonds in a glucose molecule. So it's it's very important that we um, it's very important that we take that into account. Okay, it's very important. It says that a certain amount of energy is needed to break excuse me, bonds between different types of atoms have different bond energies. So let me write that down right here. Okay, bonds between different types of atoms bonds between different types of atoms have different energy or bond energy. Okay, have different bond energies. That means that the type, depending on the type of bond, let me see if I can move this a little bit here so that you guys can see what I wrote. Okay, have different bond energies. All right. So different types of bonds have different types of energy. So bonds between different types of atoms have different energy. That means again, bonds between different types of atoms have different energy, and that all that means is that if I have a covalent bond or if I have a hydrogen bond, the amount of energy that I'd have to apply to break that bond is going to be different. It's going to vary. So let's move on. I'm actually going to erase this. I'm going to leave the equations, the chemical equations. And again, you can just kind of pause and rewind the video if you feel like you need to go over some of the concepts or you missed something. So let's continue on in the section to talk about bond energies. Um, and another thing that's good to important is that energy is released when bonds form. So whenever, for example, these bonds are broken, to break these bonds, I have to add energy, and to form the products, okay, I need energy is released. So it's good to understand. Energy is released when bonds form. So when bonds form, energy is released. When bonds form, energy is released. When bonds form, energy is released. In the case that we're talking about here, so if we're going to look at this equation here, I add energy to break the bonds, which is what I'm trying to illustrate here. I'm adding energy to break the bonds. And in the products, I energy is released. So when the carbon dioxide and water forms, energy is released. Okay, so that's what it's trying to explain to us. Okay. Um, Chemical equilibrium. Let's talk a little bit about chemical equilibrium. Okay. So, chemical equilibrium. What is chemical equilibrium? Basically, equilibrium means balance. So, when we talk about chemical equilibrium in a nutshell, what it's trying to say is that chemical reactions, especially in living organisms, are going to keep occurring until they're balanced. And when they're balanced, it stops. It's kind of like when we talked about homeostasis, it has a negative feedback. So, if we look at your book and it talks about chemical equilibriums, it says some reactions go from reactants to products until the reactants are used up. However, many reactions in living organisms are reversible. They move in both directions at the same time. These reactions tend to go in one direction or the other depending on the concentrations of reactants and products. On one such reaction lets blood, shown in figure 4.2, carry carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide reacts with water in blood to form a compound called carbonic acid. Your body needs this reaction to get rid of carbon dioxide waste from your cells. So, what can we get at that? And now I'm going to delete this. Now I am going to delete all these images because we're going to talk about a different chemical reaction. So, the first thing that we want to talk about is that some reactions go from reactants to products until the reactants are used up. So some reactions go from reactants to products, go from reactants to products until the reactions are used up. The reactions or the reactants until the reactants are used up. Until the reactants are used up. Okay, and the other thing that we need to know is that many reactions are reversible. So when we talk about carbonic acid, or your book talks about carbonic acid, and I'm gonna write the chemical formula right there. Um, are reversible in living organisms. Let me write that. Let me specify that is organisms and move in both directions. Okay. The reactions tend to go in both directions. The reactants tend to go in both directions. Okay, the reactants tend to go in both directions. the reactions tend to go in both directions. Now, what it means, and this is extremely important in living organisms, and your book talks about the forming of carbonic acid. And let me explain that real quick. So, carbonic acid, which is H2CO3, is used or is found or in our blood or can be made in our blood to eliminate carbon dioxide from our blood. If we have carbon dioxide running around in our blood system, that can be extremely dangerous. So this carbonic acid is kind of like a buffer. And what it does is that it eliminates the excess amount of carbon dioxide in our blood. But this has to be reversible. And when a reaction is reversible, it'll usually have two arrows, one going from left to right, and then another one underneath it going from right to left. And what the reverse and the importance of this being a reversible reaction is because it helps maintain our homeostasis. Because if we couldn't reverse this reaction, then that means we'd have an excess amount of carbonic acid, and that can be very dangerous. So let me explain what I'm trying to say. Let me illustrate. Let's look at the reaction real quick. The reaction says carbon dioxide and water. So we have carbon dioxide and water, because remember that our blood is actually it's mainly water. It says carbon dioxide and water, so plus water. And remember, these are going to be our reactants because these are the substances that are going to change. Okay, carbon dioxide and water, one molecule each. Carbon dioxide and water, they each have one molecule of carbon dioxide, one molecule of water. And again, reversible. It means it can go from right to left to right and also from right to left. Okay, so carbon dioxide and water react to form carbonic acid, which we said was H2CO3. So the carbonic acid is used to eliminate carbon dioxide waste products in our bloodstream. And carbonic acid is an acid, which means that if this reaction were not reversible, meaning that I can go from left to right or from right to left, if this reaction were not reversible, that can be extremely dangerous and can cause a lot of complications. Okay. So it says the arrows in the equation above show that the reaction goes in both directions. When the carbon dioxide concentration is high as it is around your cells, the reaction moves towards the right and carbonic acid forms. If the constant in your, excuse me, um, in your lungs, the carbon dioxide concentration is low. The reaction goes in the other direction and carbonic acid breaks down. So basically, this is explaining to us that this reaction will occur. So, for example, if there's more carbon dioxide, that basically what it's trying to say here is that if there were more carbon dioxide present, then in our bloodstream, then there you go. If there was more concentration of carbon dioxide, then that means that the direction of the reaction will go from left to right, so that carbonic acid is formed. If there's more concentration of carbonic acid and less concentration of carbon dioxide, then the equation would move from right to left, and carbon dioxide and water would be formed. And this is very important in order for an organism to be able to maintain homeostasis. Now, what we're going to talk about is equilibrium in a reaction. So equilibrium is reached when both reactants and products are at the same rate. So in these kind of reactions, especially reversible in most reactions, but more specifically in reactions that go in both direction. I'm sorry, they're going to continue to react until equilibrium is formed, and equilibrium is reached. equilibrium is reached when both reactants and products are made at the same rate. When both reactants and products are made at the same rate. That means that the production of reactants and products are the same or made pretty much at the same rate, meaning that they're pretty much made at the same time or with the same speed or the same energy. Okay, so once there's a chemical equilibrium, usually the reaction stops. And now we're going to talk about chemical reactions, how they release or absorb energy. And it says that all chemical reactions involve changes in energy that is, and that's important. That's actually very important. So let me go ahead and erase this and write that down. Let me go ahead and write it down. Okay, so all chemical reactions involve changes in energy. So all chemical reactions, whether a lot or a little, involve changes in energy, and that's very important. Involve changes in energy. It says energy that is added to the reactions break their chemical bonds. When new bonds form in the product, energy is released. This means that energy is both absorbed and released during a chemical reaction. This is also important. Energy is both absorbed and released in a chemical reaction. And if we look at the reaction that we were talking about a minute ago, which was the carbonic acid and the carbon dioxide and water. So energy is added here to break these bonds of carbon dioxide and water to form the carbonic acid. And also, energy is released. So I add energy here to break these bonds. And when these new bonds form, then energy is released. So here in the reactants, energy is added and here energy is released. Okay, so this means that energy is both absorbed and released during a chemical reaction. Some chemical reactions release more energy than others, and then they absorb. Other chemical reactions absorb more energy than they release. Whether a reaction releases or absorbs energy depends on bond energy. And it says some energy must be absorbed by the reactants in any chemical reaction. And we're going to talk about activation energy. So energy is, there's an exchange of energy in the reactants. Some reactions absorb more energy than they release, others release more energy than they absorb. That means that in some reactions I'm actually making more new compounds than I am reactants. So that's why it says that more energy is released. And sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes I barely make. Sometimes I add more energy than I release. That means they require a lot of energy and don't really make a whole lot of product. So we're going to talk about two types of energy used in chemical reaction, and the first one is activation energy. So let's talk about activation energy. And activation energy is the amount of energy that needs to be absorbed for a chemical reaction to start. Is the amount of energy that needs to be absorbed is the amount of energy that needs to be absorbed for a chemical reaction to start. for a chemical reaction to start. Now that's activation energy. And in a minute, we're going to talk about um, other types of reaction, exothermic and endothermic. And that's pretty much it for today. Okay. So, talking about activation energy, we know that it's the amount of energy that is the amount of energy that needs to be absorbed for a chemical reaction to start. But another thing about activation energy is that it's like the energy you would need. They compare it to the energy you would need to push a rock up a hill. Once the rock is at the top of the hill, it rolls down uh, the other side by itself. It is a graph of activation energy that is added to start a chemical reaction is shown at the top of figure 4.3 of your textbooks. You can go ahead and look at that when you guys have your textbooks. But basically, activation energy is the amount of energy that I need. They compare it to pushing a rock up a hill. Obviously, to roll a rock down the hill, it'd be a lot easier. So let's see if I can try to illustrate what that's trying to say. And what it's trying to say is that if we have a hill, and again, I am not the best drawer in the world, but let's say you have to push this rock up a hill. Activation energy is kind of like that energy that the reaction needs to get started. So it would be the amount of energy that I need to start pushing this rock up a hill. Now, once I push the rock up the hill and I'm going to roll it down the other side, I don't really need that much activation energy because gravity pretty much does what it needs. So let's say that once I push that rock over here. So once the chemical reaction has enough activation energy, it'll pretty much continue to move on by itself. And that's what that comparison is trying to say, is that activation energy is like that energy that I need to start pushing that rock up a hill. So it's the amount of energy that needs that a chemical reaction needs in order to get started. Some chemical reactions require more activation energy than others, but nonetheless, activation energy is required. Now, let's talk about exothermic reactions, okay? So, an exothermic reaction, let me clear all this. An exothermic reaction, an exo means outside. So, you can only imagine that and thermic means temperature. So it says an exothermic chemical reaction releases more energy than it absorbs. So exothermic reactions release more energy than they absorb. They release more energy than they absorb. Exothermic chemical reactions release more energy than they absorb. It says if the products have a lower bond energy than the reactants, the reaction is exothermic. Okay, so let me read that again. If the products have a lower bond energy than the reactants, the reaction is exothermic. So let me write that down because that's also very important. If the products if the products have a lower bond energy than the reactants, if the products have lower bond energy than the reactants, then the reaction is exothermic. Is exothermic. And the reaction is exothermic. Okay? It says the excess energy, the difference in bond energy between the reactants and products, is often given off as heat or light. It says some animals, such as squids and fireflies, give off light that comes from exothermic reaction. Okay, So some, let me write that down as well. Some animals such as squids and fireflies, some animals such as squids and fireflies, some animals such as squids and fireflies give off light that um, give off light that comes from exothermic reactions. Give off light that comes from exothermic reactions. Comes from exothermic reactions. Okay. Cellular respiration, the process that uses glucose and oxygen to provide usable chemical energy, is also exothermic. Okay, so cellular respiration is also exothermic. Is also exothermic. Cellular respiration is also exothermic. Now let's talk about endothermic. Okay. An endothermic chemical reaction absorbs more energy than it releases. Now let me change the color so we can distinguish. Endothermic reactions, endothermic reactions absorb more energy than it releases. Absorbs more energy than it releases. Absorbs more energy than it releases. Absorbs more energy than it releases. It says if products have a higher bond energy than reactants, if products have if products have if products have a higher bond energy than reactants, if products have higher bond energy than reactants, the reaction is endothermic. Is endothermic. Is endothermic. It says energy must be absorbed to make up the difference. One of the most important processes for life on Earth, photosynthesis, is endothermic. So let's write that. Photosynthesis is endothermic. That means that it absorbs more energy or more heat. Okay. Um, and it says during photosynthesis, plants absorb energy from sunlight, and use that energy to make simple sugar and complex carbohydrates. Ladies and gentlemen, that is it for section 2.4. Hopefully, this video will help you review some of the most important concepts that were discussed in the class. So, I hope you guys have an awesome day. Bye bye.